Hi, everybody. So, we're doing something a bit unusual today. We're doing a special episode, and this is because of a very troubling and important subject that here at the Equiano Project we've dived a little bit into over the years. But essentially, the government's done a huge U-turn on the grooming gang scandal and a national inquiry. For months, they said that they weren't going to hold a national inquiry, and actually, Keir Starmer had made some worrying comments, often saying that those that were demanding a national inquiry were jumping on a far right bandwagon. We also had another Labour minister, I think Lucy Powell, in a conversation in Any Questions on the BBC, when another speaker, I think his name is Tim Montgomery, spoke about the grooming gang. She said, "Oh, you're blowing that trumpet. This is a dog whistle." So this is something that the government have avoided for many months, but it's clear that it's become untenable. And in light of a report by Louise Casey, they have now said that they will hold a national inquiry into grooming gangs. Now, we're not going to tell you all of the details. We really recommend you look. It's been very widely reported, but it is a national scandal of epic proportions in the UK, which involved group based child sexual exploitation going back decades, where thousands of predominantly white, but there were victims of various different races, girls of working class background from the ages of 10, 11, 12, were raped, trafficked, and tortured by predominantly Pakistani Muslim older men. And this has been a scandal that has been exposed in many reports. Telford report, the Rotherham report, Rochdale, where in lots of parts of the country this was happening. And one of the most striking things about this, if striking can even be the most appropriate word, is that many of the reports found that the children were not believed, partly because these men were targeting girls that were in care, that were from kind of dysfunctional and chaotic homes, but also because the police feared that the fact that the perpetrators were overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslim men in many of these instances, that they feared being accused of being racist, and they feared stoking community tensions and stoking racial tensions. And the reason we're talking about this at the Equiano Project, because I think it really goes to the heart of everything that we do. And I think it's one of the most uh, terrifying, really, examples of what happens when you or we don't speak openly and truthfully about race related matters, and some of the horrific scandals that can take place when people use the fear of racism or even weaponize race in order to silence dissent, silence discussion, and chill important public debate and scrutiny about a whole range of areas. Now, we believe that we are all human, we are individuals, and no group has a monopoly on evil, no group has a monopoly on violence, and but no group fundamentally is above the law. And if you are a Pakistani Muslim man, and as part of that group, that group disproportionately is enacting crime, uh, we will talk about that. Just as if there was something that was disproportionately being perpetrated by white perpetrators, we would equally talk about that and want to understand all of the factors. 'Cause I think there is a risk in just saying, "Oh well, you know, crimes are committed by all groups." That is true, but as we know, young black men are disproportionately involved in certain serious youth violence. We know that you know I think I've actually read some statistics as well that some white men are disproportionately involved in indecent images of children. We have to understand why that is, and we should never use fear of race or racism as a reason. A quick outline of some of the things that came out on Monday in relation to what the report said by Louise Casey. She said that, quote, you know, we have so far been unable to provide an assessment on the scale of group-based child sexual exploitation, and adds it is a failure of public policy over many years but there remains such limited reliable data in this area, end quote. And I think that's extremely telling, despite the fact that this scandal has been going on for decades. There's still such a limited information. The report also said the ethnicity of perpetrators is, quote, shied away from and not recorded for 2/3 of perpetrators. The report looked at three parts of the UK, where there'd been greater collection of ethnicity data, Greater Manchester, South Yorkshire, and West Yorkshire, and found there had been a disproportionality of race child sexual exploitation offending by men of Asian ethnicity, end quote. So we recommend that you look into that report, and it has a lot of details and recommendations, such as one of the recommendations is that we need further research into, quote, drivers of group race sexual exploitation, including online offending, cultural factors, and the role of the group. So I'm now going to chat to our head of content, Ada Akpala, to just get some initial reactions from her about what she thinks in relation to this announcement that there will be a national inquiry.
Yeah, so a lot of people are saying that this is too little too late, and I almost agree to an extent. It's never too late, of course, when it comes to seeking justice, especially when we're talking about this mass scale sort of systemic patterned abuse. And the fact that it's going to be done with this national inquiry is a very big step. But as you mentioned at the start, this is just all a big mess. You know, if you're from when you're talking about Keir Starmer's role at the time during, you know, those initial incidents to, you know, the culture of silence because of identity-based concerns. But of course, the biggest factor here is the fact that this almost cultural relativism, right? You know, people felt so uncertain, so afraid, so cautious, so hesitant dealing with the offenders because they were from minority backgrounds. And then you have sometimes people saying, well, and we've heard some politicians say this as well in this line, it's not about race. Don't make it about race. But of course, it completely is. It completely is about, you know, it doesn't mean that there are inherent issues, but there are patterns. And to deny that is what has caused this decades of delay and dragging of feet. It's about race because of 3 points. The fact that this racial, you know, awakening that has happened in society. And it seems like when it's the, you know, perhaps white perpetrators, then it's completely about race. But then when it comes to people who are from minority backgrounds, then actually it's not about race. Let's look at isolated incidents when it's not about isolated incidents. And it's about race on another front because the perpetrators themselves have said, you know, they targeted the victims because they were white, because they were non-Muslim, because they were infidels, because their parents, their families didn't care for them. So, you know, it didn't matter the abuse that was done to them. And again, it's about race because of the silence, the reluctance, you know, the cowardice to hold people to account. And I think, you know, just last point quickly, this, and I've said this before, this grooming gang scandal is a huge stain on this country. And it's not going to go away for a very long time, right? It's left a very negative legacy. And it's great that this inquiry is coming out, and it should be a warning and a lesson to current leaders and current politicians that even if whatever they may be hiding or dragging their feet on currently, they need to make sure that it's brought to the light immediately, because they will be held to account sooner or later. And the longer they leave it, the worse our trust, which has been completely broken, will take to rebuild.
No, I think you make such important points, Ada, and I think the fact that what your point about how it's been made about race because of the inaction, I think is such a crucial point, and I think for several reasons. One, because the mainstream liberal institutions, no doubt there have been some people that have spoken up and investigated this over the decades, but because there was so much silence and reluctance within the establishment, then then it almost makes it more about race, because then you start to think, oh, are certain people being treated differently? or what is being silenced? Is this a racial issue? And I remember when Jeremy Corbyn was still leader of the Labour Party, Sarah Champion, she's a Labour MP, she was removed as a minister. She was forced to resign. She brought up the grooming gangs because she is still actually an MP of an area where that was hugely affected. I remember that she was described as incendiary for writing an article in The Sun talking about this. Much earlier than that, there was another Labour MP called Anne Cryer, um, years and years ago, who brought this up and was silenced and harangued for doing so. And there's been journalists like Andrew Norfolk, who sadly recently died. He was one of the first to expose the grooming gangs over a decade ago. And it's sad he didn't live to see that a national inquiry did take place. But another female, Julie Bindel, she is a feminist journalist and she has been writing and exposing this issue for years and was actually given Islamophobe of the Year award for doing so. I mean, it is absolutely sickening. And that there's actually a number of Muslim and Pakistani origin individuals that have spoken up too, who again were silenced or chastised, both from within their community but also the establishment. I think one of the reasons why the so much of the establishment have been so reluctant to talk about this is because so many of their deeply held narratives is shattered by this. This whole idea of white privilege, that just because you're white, you're inherently privileged or hold certain advantages over other groups. Well, the white privilege clearly didn't shield these girls in this horrific incident. And if that's the only thing that you can say when white people in a specific context are being disproportionately victimized, then you can show how so many of these narratives can actually blind you to people's suffering. But also, as you mentioned, the cultural relativism, like the inability to even believe that there could be cultural factors specific to groups that can make them disproportionately engage in evil acts. And I can think about many of those cultural factors, whether that's the fact that so many of these men work in the nighttime economy, like taxi drivers, or takeaway shops, or corner shops, where they often have access to vulnerable people that are like on their own, potentially drunk or using drugs at late hours or of the night or early hours of the morning. These men come from very insular communities that often have very misogynistic and backwards attitudes to women. So when they're exposed to young women outside of their community, they've not grown up with norms about how to treat those women. But also, I think it's a very taboo topic, but also cousin marriage, because if you look, one of the most striking cultural factors in the grooming gang is how many of them are involved with family members, uncles, fathers, brothers. This is a particular kind of group-based cover up that we see, and a familial pattern of offending. We've got to talk about that, no matter how uncomfortable. And I just think that is how you prevent racist attitudes from developing. That is how you do it. Because if you don't, you leave the space open to people that don't care. They don't care at all, because they would weaponize issues for their own political ends. Whereas if people that are opposed to racism but support the truth talk about things in a frank and open way, then we remove the racism fear out of it, because we're actually looking at what's really going on. So yeah, I completely agree with you about the cultural relativism, about the importance of discussing race within this, and I think that's what we hope to do and will continue to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've basically summarized it and you hit the nail on the head. It's not talking about it that's going to cause, or exacerbate racist attitudes. It's the acts themselves, and moreover, the covering up the acts because of ethnic or racial components to it. And, I think apart from narratives that caused politicians to drag their feet on this, I think it's also the idea that they have very established voting blocks as well within these communities that they didn't want to disturb, right? And it also shatters this narrative of multiculturalism in a sense, which I speak a lot about. And, you know, you can understand people's concerns and worries. It's not just the integration front, which is one issue, but it's also when, you know, communities are sort of settled in. How are politicians dealing with communities as one unit, as one society, or as different micro societies? And that's why, you know, people will continue to have these concerns and these pushbacks against unchecked multiculturalism if these things don't stop happening.
I just think there's one more point I want to make. This is, again, not to say that there are not white offenders. I know that this is an obvious point to make, but I think that there's a lot of people that try and shut down the discussion that say, yes, but what about white offenders? And of course, all forms of sexual abuse is horrific. The difference is, in this instance, is the fact that the race, the fact that they were white, was not used as a reason to cover for the crimes of perpetrators. If the fact that those perpetrators were white were being used by the establishment and institutions to cover for certain crimes, then we, and I think many of the people talking about this, would be all over that subject, doing as much as we can to expose it. It is the fact that that was used to shield perpetrators and continues to be used in many instances, including via that particular accusation that, well, why are you just focused on Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs? Well, the reason is because that was used to shut down the discussion. So whoever is committing horrific crimes and using race as a way to shield themselves is something that is disgusting and appalling, and we will call out. And in this instance, this was what was done, and therefore that's why we're focusing on it.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you know, thank you so much, Ada, for your thoughts, and I completely agree. We're now going to watch a little clip that I had done with the BBC on BBC Politics Live on Tuesday, talking about the grooming gang scandal and the government's response to it.
I agree that hopefully we can move forward, but I don't think that we can overlook what has happened over the last 20 years. I thank the courageous victims for relentlessly campaigning, but also there were Labour and left-wing female politicians and journalists such as Sarah Champion, Anne Cryer, Julie Bindel, who were labelled Islamophobic, who were labelled racist.
And this is because many of the grooming gangs were men of Pakistani heritage.
Significantly disproportionately Pakistani and of Muslim heritage.
Well, what Louise Casey actually said is that the figures actually weren't being collected. So it's very difficult to even tell. And she said that is part of the problem here.
Not only that, she actually said that one of the previous Home Office reports that said that the most common perpetrator of group-based child sexual exploitation were white was basically based off of no evidence. And we're seeing even more shocking statistics that a significant number of the live cases right now are asylum seekers and also non-UK nationals. So it is a start, but this has essentially been overlooked out of fear of inflaming community tensions, out of fear of being racist. Oftentimes, actually, people within the Muslim community that have been speaking up about this, many people that I've spoken to, have also been silenced because people just do not want to rock the boat. And I think that that is a chilling and disgusting message to say that abuse can be overlooked or turned a blind eye because we're going to prioritise certain things that make us uncomfortable or we don't want to rock the boat. I think that is awful.
Ruffle, do you think that people did shy away from saying these
look,
things?
I think the victims have been let down by all sorts of political shades. I mean, that's very clear. Baroness Casey has said that. And that's precisely why it is really important that there is cross-party consensus on getting change to happen. I'm delighted that we finally got to a national inquiry. I think that's something that's very important. And on data collection, on collecting ethnicity and nationality, it's actually a scandal that this hasn't been collected before. We collect this in so many other areas of life precisely because it gives important information to recognise patterns, to solve problems. And it reinforces how big a scandal this is, that this hasn't been collected in the past and that false recommendations or interpretations have been placed upon flawed data. I'd also just like to mention, it's worth saying as well, you know, the role that misogyny played in this too, how victims were treated like perpetrators. I mean, this is outrageous. This happened in Britain in the 21st century. It has to change.
Rachel?
Yeah, I certainly think data is absolutely key, and that collection of data will really help us look to the future, because this is about protecting children in the future
but do
as
you
well.
think that some in Labour did put their head in the sand over ethnicity? They got it wrong?
Well, we have to see the data, but I would say that, you know, that wasn't drilled in hard enough. But we also need to recognise that a scale of child abuse which is familial as well, and we need to collect all of that data and bring it together at source to understand exactly those patterns of abuse. And of course what's happening online, as we heard yesterday in the House, the fact that this scale of abuse would have started online had it started today. So we've got to get a grip of what's happening, not only with the big tech companies, but also with what's happening in people's own homes every single day.
It's important to say that it's not talking about this issue that fuels racism and bigotry and hate. It is the shutting down of discussion, because it's then people feel like they're being gaslit when there's things that they can see in front of their own eyes, and they're seeing disproportionalities and disparities that are not being explained and are being shied away from. And that leaves the ground open for what I think are bad faith actors that want to demonise particular communities and want to make racist claims. It's important for the mainstream to make sure that that vacuum isn't being filled by the wrong people. And the only way you do that is to actually speak frankly and openly. It's not just about ethnicity. There's culture, there's social values, there's familial attitudes that we need to look at. And only when we can confront that do we take it away from those that actually do want to divide communities.
And better safeguarding as well. And I think that's what came out yesterday. We know particularly children who have got care experience have been targeted by many of these gangs, and we need to ensure better safeguarding in that area. But also I was delighted that the Home Secretary said that she's going to get a grip on the licensing of taxis. It's been a big issue. My authority has been trying to come to terms with. It puts in excellent safeguarding training for taxis, it licenses, but has no control of people coming into our city.
This is because it was established, wasn't it, a very long time ago, that some of these gangs, that's how they were operating, was through taxi drivers. Yeah. But that's an issue that's been around for a very long time.
Indeed, indeed. There was a Law Commission report on this, and governments, again, have not enacted on that. The last government didn't, and many of us have been struggling with this particular factor, because we know that people are coming into our own locations but have no accountability to the local authorities. So this will help build a bigger picture and more robust systems in order to get on top of this.